Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's a History podcast. I am your host, Madison, and this week we are going to be looking at the history of crochet. This week's episode is a sort of companion to episode 61, where I spoke to Nicole Narig about her most recent release, With Her Own Hands, where we talked about women's role in the history of fiber arts. Last week we looked at the history of knitting, which has a long storied history of new discoveries and sharing of knowledge across cultural lines. That leads us into this week, where we dive into the history of crochet. While not as long and storied as the history of knitting, the history of crochet still has a story to tell. Before we really begin, for those who are unfamiliar with the differences between knitting and crochet, knitting is worked with two needles where all stitches are quote-unquote active, and crochet is made with a single hook with one active stitch at a time. So with that, let's get right into today's episode. Crochet, as we know it, is a relatively new form of fiber art. Where knitting, weaving, and embroidery have been around for at this point thousands of years, crochet is possibly only a few hundred years old. Note my use of possibly. The exact origins of crochet seem to be pretty hard to narrow down, which, given its rather recent addition to the fiber arts catalog, is quite interesting. There are some examples of pieces that are thousands of years old, such as a work that was found in an Egyptian tomb that would have been crafted somewhere between 900 and 1100 CE. Though the museum that displays it calls the piece threadwork, if you actually look at this piece of fabric, it looks remarkably similar to double crochet stitches, which are a pretty basic stitch within the crochet stitch catalog. Prior to what we would actually call crochet work, there was a style of crafting called shepherd's knitting that utilizes slip stitches or looping one stitch to another. Shepherd's knitting kind of lives in a space between knitting and crochet, but as time has gone on, it has found itself as a precursor to crocheting instead of being considered an offshoot of knitting. But that can depend on who you ask or what source you look at. There is some evidence that crochet developed sometime in the 16th century and was originally known as crochet lace or chain lace. There are even other competing theories that crochet may have originated in Arabia and spread through various trade routes. That it may have originated in South America, where it was used in creating crochet pieces that could be used in puberty rites. Or that it originated in China, having been used to make three-dimensional dolls. Now, this is just me, but I do think that it is entirely possible that different cultural groups all managed to come up with a similar way of working thread through loops to create various pieces. It is also not uncommon to find that men would use crochet to make tools that they needed for hunting, creating traps and snares, by carefully crafting with various woven fibers, cords, or even strips of cloth. I find it completely reasonable that various groups could have independently come up with the same idea around the same time. With that in mind, the most concrete example we have of the development of crochet would be the act of crocheting evolving from a type of embroidery known as tambour. This type of embroidery was very popular in areas like Turkey, India, North Africa, and China. Tambour embroidery is a type of embroidery where a piece of fabric would be stretched over a drum or a frame to be taut. Using a needle, the thread was worked up from the back of the fabric, then the needle would be inserted into the top of the fabric to make a loop. A second loop would be made adjacent to the first loop, which the thread of the second loop would be pulled through the first loop to create a chain. This process would repeat throughout the fabric until the desired image was complete. As we entered into the 18th century, the background fabric was eventually discarded, and the crafter would instead work the stitches into themselves in what the French would call crocheting in the air. With this transition to working without any backing fabric, crochet started to spread all around Europe. And the 18th century is when we really start to see examples of what we would actually call crochet popping up. The first crocheted items primarily seem to be imitations of lace. Lace was created through the use of lace bobbins, where threads from multiple bobbins would be laced over each other to create intricate patterns. Early crochet functioned as a way to imitate lacework, as lacework was very expensive and very difficult to do. During the Irish potato famine, Irish men, women, and children would spend whatever time they had not working in the field crocheting, even long into the night by candlelight or oil light. Like those first early crochet works, the Irish were crocheting imitation lace, which they would actually sell to make some money. As I mentioned, the art of creating lace is quite difficult and time-consuming. The Irish way of making lace had emerged as its own distinct style that was much quicker to produce than the traditional way of making lace, and was actually profitable. According to the Lacis Museum, it is generally accepted that Mademoiselle Horatio de la Blanchardière, I'm very sorry for that, is the one credited with creating this distinct form of crochet. She published the first book of Irish crochet patterns in 1846, which was used in various schools of crochet that started to pop up all over Ireland and what would be a fast-growing form of cottage industry. Irish crochet is typically depicted with various motifs, whether they be flowers, shamrocks, or grapevines, that would be connected with a mesh-like stitching, mimicking a lace look. And while there was a pattern for creating this lace, it still held plenty of room for the individual crafter to add their own spin and personality to it. For the Irish, cotton thread was relatively inexpensive to obtain and it was easy to clean. The work could be done any time of day, and given the harsh conditions that plagued Ireland during the famine years, the lace would end up quite dirty. Just before the item was sold for profit, it would be washed, which was why the use of cotton thread was particularly important. And with this skill being something the whole family could chip in on, there could be a sort of automation of the process. Maybe one person was really good at making motifs, so they would just make the same motif over and over again, while someone else of the family, who was perhaps really good at the lacework, would join the motifs together. Crocheting Irish lace was a way to bring the family together and a way to provide for the family during a truly trying time in Irish history. I'd like to quote Martha Sherrick Shen in speaking on the history of Irish lace. She said, "From a wellspring of ingenuity, perseverance, and community cooperation, the lace industry flourished for a time. It served as a vital cottage industry throughout the famine. It not only fed the people, but preserved their dignity. And the world took notice. In the post-famine years, its popularity waxed and waned with the flow of economic tides. Soon, the surge of 2 world wars put a harsh decline in the demand for luxuries. But by then, the lace had worked its magic and revived a nation. Today, we see its bold patterns, the life of the people, and the hope of a country." If you want to learn more about the Irish potato famine, I have a 3-part series that covers the famine in episodes 21, 22, and 23. And as a result from the famine, with the mass exodus of Irish from Ireland and many of them arriving in the US, the art of crochet was spread and added on as a skill for those who were already handy in sewing and knitting. The crochet hook itself, which for much of the early history of crochet was made out of whatever you could get your hands on, was not standardized at all. Hooks would be made of metal, wood, bone, old spoons, or even tortoiseshell. During the famine, crochet hooks would be fashioned by inserting a filed-down bit of wire into a piece of wood or cork. And if the hooks were not standardized, you can forget about the patterns that were available being standardized. The first published patterns that we know of came from the 19th century. Early Dutch patterns even go on to dictate how one should hold the hook and yarn in one's hand, originally stating that the hook and yarn both be held in the right hand, which later transitioned into holding the hook in the right hand and the yarn in the left. In the history of crochet, Ruthie Marks quotes a German publication from 1847 that stated one should always keep the same tension, either crochet loosely or tightly, otherwise an attractively even texture will not be achieved. Moreover, if not working in the round, you have to break off your yarn at the end of each row, since that gives a finer finish to the crocheted article. As a crocheter, I think I would cry if I had to cut the yarn off after every row. Sewing in ends is the absolute worst part of making a crochet project. With the nature of the craft, crocheted objects generally have a more lacy-like texture to them, where knitting can create a compact piece of fabric that is more suited for clothing. Crocheting did happen throughout the 20th century, but it is something that was seen second to knitting. The Arizona State University Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising Museum has examples of crochet throughout the 20th century, including a crocheted dress that utilized a type of granny stitch from the 1960s. Often seen as the other craft when compared to knitting, crochet, much like other fiber arts, has had a resurgence in popularity thanks to social media and the pandemic. Unlike knitting, which has been mechanized, crochet can only be done by hand. So whenever you see something that is crocheted, just know that it was handmade by someone. Each stitch was done by hand, something a machine at this point in time just can't replicate. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. I hope you learned something new about the history of crochet. While not as lengthy as the history of knitting, there is something to be had about the art of looping thread through itself to create works such as lace, blankets, or cardigans. After researching for these past 2 weeks, I think there is something to be said about the way these kinds of fiber arts are passed along through time, and even how the pieces that we do have don't tell the whole story. Skills such as knitting and crochet don't just happen in a blink of an eye. They were mastered over time through trial and error, with success being shared throughout the community and over cultural lines. With knitting, the oldest examples we have of knitting contain intricate patterns, color work, and advanced technical knowledge. The socks we have were most definitely not the first socks. And the same can be said with crochet. You have to take into account the wear of natural fibers over time and even the possibility of pieces unraveling through use and thread wear, or even the purposeful unraveling of pieces to reuse the thread or yarn for something else. Sources for today's episode include The History of Crochet by Ruthie Marks, an article titled Irish Crochet Lace, 150 Years of Tradition that is published by the Lacis Museum of Lace and Textiles, an article titled Crochet from Arizona State University, and an article titled Crochet Through History by Dora Ohrenstein. Thank you again for listening to today's episode. If you liked what you heard, please head over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leave a review. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, you can email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me at It's a History Podcast over on Instagram and Threads. I'm pretty active on both. Thank you again, and I hope to have you in the next one, where we are going to start a small series on the history of weddings.